You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 31st of May, 2024 on Monocle Radio. It is 1500 in Dubai, 1400 in Kharkiv, midday here in London, and 7 a.m. in New York City. You're listening to Monocle Radio. The Briefing starts now. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program.
The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people, and they know what happened here and everybody knows what happened here.
Donald Trump vows to fight on despite being convicted on 34 felony counts by a Manhattan jury, because only in the United States can a convicted felon continue running for office. We'll have the latest. After that, we will head to a Dubai aviation conference. We'll look at Western policy reversals in allowing Ukraine to strike inside Russia, and we'll get an update on Iran's presidential elections. Finally,
while the campaign is in full swing in other countries, the upcoming Dutch government, which will likely start in earnest at the end of June, plans a rather Eurosceptic course. So how will that attitude influence the future position of the Netherlands in the European Union?
The latest in our European Parliament elections series will head to the Netherlands. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. In the end, it would take a Manhattan jury just around 24 hours to reach an historic verdict in the United States, the first ever conviction of an American president, current or former, for committing a crime. Donald Trump was found guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records. The U.S. is hardly the first country to have a leader found guilty of criminal charges, but it is one of the few to now have a convicted felon still running for the highest office in the land. Both campaigns have acknowledged that, although the courts will decide Donald Trump's sentence on the 11th of July, Donald Trump's political future will only be decided in November. Well, joining me now is Julie Norman, lecturer in politics and international relations at UCL and co-director of the UCL Center on U.S. Politics. Julie, great to have you back on the show. Let's start simple. Your reaction to the verdict yesterday.
Well, good afternoon, Chris. I would say we all obviously knew that the jury would be making a decision, but I would put myself in the camp of I was surprised by the verdict. I think many of us thought it would be a hung jury, that it would take them at least a bit more time maybe to get to a guilty verdict if they got there. So the decision and the speed with which they got there, I think, did take some of us by surprise. And now it's jumping into the next round of all of this and what it means.
Well, and when it comes then to what it means, when you say that you're surprised, I suppose that's one of the interesting aspects of this particular case, isn't it? That everyone felt this was the weak one. They might not even necessarily convict Donald Trump in New York. It was the three other cases that mattered. How much, given that, do you think the fact that he was convicted here in New York moves the goalposts sort of for the public perception in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's obviously been a lot of trying to pull ahead, if Trump is convicted, will this change how people view him? And honestly, Chris, I think it'll probably come out in a wash. We've seen a mix in different polls, maybe upwards of 15 to 20% of Trump supporters who say they would maybe reconsider their vote if he was convicted. But again, what people say and what they actually do doesn't always line up. And again, at the end of the day, I think most of his supporters will see this trial as an overreach, as politically motivated, as a witch hunt, as Trump says, and will probably double down on their enthusiasm. So I think at the end of the day, I don't think the polls will move all that much because of this conviction.
And Julie, for international listeners, how do you explain that to people? The fact that we have the first ever criminal conviction of a head of state in the United States. In other countries, it would seem like this would be a bigger deal that would move the polls, or if not move the polls, they would simply be barred from running for office.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think that is the piece that is most surprising to people. Maybe not that he still has popular support, because I do think we've seen that in other countries, heads of state who are brought up on, say, corruption charges, but still have a lot of popular support. But more the idea that our Constitution does not prevent someone with a felony charge from still running and holding office. And that's simply because the Constitution does not address it one way or the other. So I think internationally, this is a very surprising fact that Trump can just carry on with the campaign and perhaps serving in office. But again, it's one thing that in the United States, we're even just going to figure out how to navigate that over these next 6 months and possibly longer.
Well, have you, though, in that respect, been surprised that in the United States, I mean, are we just so polarized at this point that there is simply no discussion about this, no discussion about whether a president, former or current, should be barred from office for committing a crime?
You know, Chris, I think it's just the unprecedented nature of it. And, if this moves forward, if Trump, is elected in November, there may be some revisiting to some of the laws or absence of them, as is often the case. It's simply just something we haven't dealt with. But those conversations are certainly happening. And from a Democrat's point of view and from Biden's point of view, this is where voters need to weigh in. There's nothing official. There's nothing legally that keeps Trump out of office. The only thing that can is what voters decide in November. And that's what Biden is going to emphasize.
How much do you expect then, given that Biden will actually emphasize this? He hasn't wanted to really speak about this case because it is a very tricky issue in the United States, of course, because Donald Trump is basically saying that this is Joe Biden's doing, right? He is the one who is leading these charges, criminal charges against Donald Trump, the witch hunt and all that. So how do you expect this to actually play out in the campaign going forward?
That's right. And I think it's an important point that Biden will avoid, weighing in on the trial or the trials directly for the reasons you just mentioned. But I think what we saw his campaign put out last night right after the verdict was what we'll hear more of, which essentially said, only the ballot box will keep Trump out of office. So essentially saying to Democrats and, independents and others, look, this verdict is not going to stop Trump. It's the political process. It's the votes that matter, and really trying to emphasize the need to get out the vote largely for that reason.
And just to focus a little bit globally as well, I wonder if you feel this will have any impact, I suppose, on Donald Trump's global reputation. He has been meeting with some leaders, former leaders, different people trying to sort of feel him out in case he becomes president in November. Will there be any impact, do you think, this conviction on any of that?
Obviously having just this label of Donald Trump, convicted felon, obviously does add to his reputation overseas. I wouldn't say it's shining in many, Western European countries as it is, and this will just knock it down even a knock further. But I would say, Trump isn't new. We've had him in office. We've seen him on the scene for the last 8 years. I don't think this is going to take necessarily many people by surprise or somehow change their image of him for better or for worse, as much as just reinforce how they already saw him.
Well, and you do mention Western nations, but then there are also others like, for example, Vladimir Putin, or for that matter, even someone like Benjamin Netanyahu, who are perhaps waiting for Donald Trump in some way, somebody they believe might be more favorable. Do you imagine that they're also looking at this as something that, I don't know, maybe doesn't raise Trump's esteem in their eyes, but nevertheless, they might still be doubling down on this hope that he actually gets elected?
Absolutely. And I think there are, with or without this conviction, there are simply, interests involved here too, with some of the ongoing conflicts in the world right now with Ukraine and the Middle East, and, different state actors and how they feel a different U.S. administration would benefit them. So there's that element. And of course, the personal element too. And of course, Netanyahu has his own justice trials in Israel that have subsumed him in recent years as well. So I would say on personal, but more on state interest level, there are many states and many leaders that will be, I think, hoping for a Trump presidency because that helps them politically as well sometimes.
Thanks very much, Julie. That was Julie Norman. Now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. The African National Congress looks set to lose the parliamentary majority it has held for 30 years in South Africa's elections. The party of the late Nelson Mandela looks likely to remain the largest political force, but it's expected the ANC will have to form a coalition with other parties for the first time in the country's post-apartheid history. China has confirmed it will not be at a peace conference on Ukraine next month. Beijing declined the invitation to the meeting in Switzerland because the conditions for them to attend were not met, including the presence of both Russia and Ukraine. The Swiss government is seeking participation from different parts of the world at the summit. And thousands of people have taken part in protests across New Zealand to voice their anger of what they say is the government's dismantling of Maori rights. This comes as the centre-right coalition government unveiled its first budget, announcing tax cuts and outlining savings in areas including housing and conservation. The government has faced various allegations of seeking to dilute the agency of Indigenous people in New Zealand since it took power in October. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
To Ukraine now, where its war with Russia may be about to take on a very different dimension. A number of Western countries, including the United States and Germany, have now said that they will allow Kyiv to strike a limited number of targets inside of Russia, including with Western weapons. Joining me now is Jenny Mathers, Senior Lecturer in International Politics at Aberystwyth University, to discuss this. Jenny, as if on cue, Ukraine has struck targets inside of Russia overnight. What can you tell us?
Absolutely. So I think it's very clear that Ukraine is not hesitating to use this new authorization. So they have struck some targets around sort of Russian oil, sort of gas facilities, oil facilities rather, oil terminal. And the idea then is to, demonstrate clearly that Ukraine now has this authority, but also it's part of the increasing and ongoing effort to strike at Russia's capability to fund and to prosecute the war.
And how significant a reversal in policy is this for the US and Germany and some of these Western nations? I mean, as you allude to there, Ukraine has been attacking Russian targets before. How much is this going to change what they're able to do?
Potentially quite a lot. I think in the short term, we have to realize that there are restrictions around what the Ukrainians are being permitted to use US and German supplied weapons for. And that is very much around the protection of Kharkiv, which has been under relentless bombardment for some time now. And so the idea is that these weapons can be used against Russian forces in Russian territory, but across the border from Kharkiv, clearly on their way to attack or intending to attack that target. So it's not a general free-for-all, but I think it does allow the Ukrainians to attack from further away from the border with Russia, which makes their forces less vulnerable as they are trying to do these attacks. So it is going to make a big difference, both morale-wise, but also in material terms to the Ukrainians.
And as you say there, so there are this ability now to help sort of stem the attack on places like Kharkiv, but there are still limits in place at the same time. Why do those limits that are still in place matter?
Well, because it prevents the Ukrainians from using US and German and other supplied weapons to attack targets much further into Russia, into Russian territory. And the reason for this is the ongoing worry on the part of many of Ukraine's Western supporters that we will, tip over whatever red lines Putin has genuinely drawn and might provoke a more of a general response, perhaps against NATO nations themselves, but perhaps an acceleration of Russia's attacks already on Ukraine, perhaps the use of nuclear weapons. So that's why the restrictions are still in place, although they are being gradually loosened.
Do we then have any more sense of that red line that you're speaking of? Where do we imagine it is? I mean, it does feel like NATO and Ukraine are just kind of constantly testing that, pushing a little bit further. Ukraine obviously wants even more than this, less limitations. But actually, before we ask the red line, let's just say, what has the reaction to this been from Russia?
Well, predictably, the first response, and the only one that I've seen so far, has come from Dmitry Medvedev, who is former president of Russia, but currently the deputy chair of the Security Council and one of the most virulent speakers when it comes to issuing threats and making dire predictions. And so he has said just today that Russia is not bluffing in its statements about the possibility of being sort of forced, as he puts it, to use tactical nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine. And he has hinted that this may not just be in Ukraine, it might be further afield. and that a conflict with the West could escalate into all-out war. And so this is really very much a continuation of the rhetoric that we've had for quite a long time about every step of additional support for Ukraine, or every reduction in the rules around how Ukraine can use that support.
And yet then, given what you've said about how this has gone in previous instances of changing, sort of moving the goalposts, what do we imagine, if Russia is bluffing at this point, do we imagine they do actually have a red line where they would consider not just threatening, but actually striking, say, a NATO target?
Well, Russian military doctrine suggests that nuclear weapons could be used by Russia if Russia's existence as a country was threatened, if Russia itself were really under threat. And, you've seen them try to make that case with stretching the rhetoric in different ways. But I think we would have some ways to go before that particular condition was actually met. But we don't know, frankly, whether the Russian leadership would adhere to that, how they would interpret existential threat. So there are many, many question marks, and we just don't know where the red lines might be, or indeed if ultimately there are any.
Well, and speaking of those question marks, I do have to ask you as well about the idea of NATO troops in Ukraine. That also, of course, is something that a number of Western nations have not ruled out, although they have also not necessarily sent troops, aside from perhaps some training missions, to Ukraine. What kind of a red line would that be for Russia?
Well, I think certainly NATO troops actively fighting against Russian forces side by side with the Ukrainians, that would be certainly regarded as, inflammatory, and there would be a lot of pushback, rhetorically. But again, it's one of these delicate dances that's been happening throughout this war. There's rhetoric which is clearly on the Russian side designed to deter supporters of Ukraine from taking whatever step it is that the rhetoric is about at that particular moment. But we just have not had any concrete sort of really actions by Russia to show that we should take the rhetoric seriously. And
just finally, Jenny, one question about the peace conference. We did hear this in the headlines as well, about China not wanting to join a peace conference being held by Ukraine in Switzerland. Russia has responded to this, saying Beijing should be the one to organize a peace conference between the two. What do you make of this news? Is there any prospect that some kind of peace conference will yield results?
Well, probably not, in the sense that it's not going to stop the war as a result of this peace conference. I think the value in it is, to a large extent, diplomatic, public relations, communications related. It allows the Ukrainians to get their demands and their position more widely disseminated and publicized. It allows them to do some diplomacy face-to-face at this meeting. Obviously, it's beneficial to them PR-wise if more states are there. This is why they were quite annoyed that Biden's not coming. This is why China not coming will be a certain amount of a blow. But at the same time, the two sides are very far apart in terms of what they are demanding for a peace agreement. And so it's not likely that we're going to get an immediate peace deal out of this summit.
Jenny Mathers, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing, and it's time now to take a look at the latest travel news with the consultant Paul Charles. Paul, thanks very much for coming on the show, especially because you have just landed in Dubai. Let's start with why you're there.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be with you. This is the IATA, International Air Transport Association annual general meeting. It's being held in the UAE for the first time. There are some 1,500 delegates arriving over the next couple of days. And of course, they'll be discussing some very pertinent issues, such as whether airline pricing can remain as high as it is, sustainability and emissions, economic issues, as well as, of course, many geopolitical issues which the world faces at the moment, which affect airlines and airports and the whole supply chain of aviation.
Tell us more about that one in particular, these geopolitical issues. I mean, it does cause quite a huge headache for travel when planes have to be rerouted for conflicts. But what can be discussed at IATA to kind of resolve that?
That's right. Some of those big issues at the moment are especially war-related. You only have to look at the impact of Ukraine on some airlines having to route around Russia. They can't overfly Russia, especially if they're a European airline. And of course, with tension in the Middle East, especially in Iran, then of course flying over Iran is also causing some airlines some issues. So those big issues actually create tension for airlines too, because if they have to reroute, if they have to find another way of getting to their destination, it could cost them a lot of money in extra fuel and time. And that an extra hour or 2 hours of flying time obviously plays havoc with crew schedules as well as passenger timetables and creates real issues for airlines. So I think at a talking shop like the IATA AGM, the airline bosses are able to put their heads together and try to find ways of lobbying both at government level and regional level to see if any changes can be made which help airlines overfly particular countries more easily.
Now, these airline bosses will also be discussing simply the summer ahead. It's looking extremely busy, which I suppose goes to some of those questions you're mentioning, whether it's geopolitical and the challenges it causes, but also infrastructure in general. How prepared are airlines for a busy summer?
Yes, you're absolutely right. This is going to be the busiest summer ever for aviation. The industry, as you know, has really picked up since COVID. Whilst it still has supply issues and capacity constraints, there's huge demand but not enough supply. It will still be the busiest ever. And that means that airports especially are going to be under enormous pressure. They are finding that some of their infrastructure is creaking, whether that be security systems that need to be replaced, whether it is the maintenance teams on the ground that can't cope with the demand for extra maintenance and the need to keep planes flying for longer due to the fact that airlines can't get enough new planes due to demand. So all of these issues create infrastructure creaks. And as a result, it means that it could lead to more uncertainty for you and I traveling this summer. Whilst many people want to get away, if the infrastructure is creaking at the seams, then it could lead to longer delays, more baggage going missing, those sorts of issues that define recent summers. And that's something that the aviation industry will have to plan carefully for to ensure that consumers are not put off flying more than ever.
Yes, issues that make travel for consumers extremely fun. Finally, just Paul, before we let you go, speaking of that creaking infrastructure, here in the UK, there's also a deadline for airports on security scanners, which they are struggling to meet. What can you tell us about that?
For June the 1st, that deadline is not going to be met, I'm afraid to say, by most airports in the UK. Whilst there are some, such as Heathrow, who in their premium wing, have managed to get new security scanners in, most airports haven't. And of course, these new rules, which were due to start on the 1st of June, are around letting us as passengers leave our liquids and laptops in our hand luggage, meaning that it should be smoother and quicker to process passengers through security channels. But most airports aren't ready for the June the 1st deadline. It has now been relaxed by the UK government, and we await to see when exactly all the airports across the UK will have the right systems in place. Some of them do, as I say, parts of Heathrow, City Airport, Birmingham Airport. There are some key airports that do have it, but not enough. And that could lead to confusion among consumers. Do they leave liquids and laptops in their hand luggage, or do they have to take them out? It depends on the airport they go through. And I think that could lead to more delays.
Busy summer creaking infrastructure. Might I suggest our listeners not follow my example and get to the airport as early as possible. Paul Charles, thank you very much. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with the briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. Now to Iran, with the dust barely settling from the unexpected death of the country's president, Ibrahim Raisi. A snap election is fast approaching. The formal registration of presidential candidates began yesterday, and hopefuls will have 5 days to register before the elections are held on the 28th of June. Now, while the helicopter crash which killed Raisi sent shockwaves around the world, anybody expecting the country's political direction to shift as a result will probably be left disappointed. To get the latest, we're joined now by the Iran specialist Holly Dagras of the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Holly, great to have you on the show. Before we get to the elections themselves, just tell us about what the mood in Iran has been like since Raisi's death.
Thank you for having me on the program, Chris. Well, I know that a lot of the media attention in the West was on the funerary processions for the late president and foreign minister and their entourage. But truth be told, Iranians, to an extent, were celebrating what had happened. We saw a lot of that pour out on social media, and we've also seen videos out of Iran where people were dancing or celebrating with what was believed to be alcohol, because this was someone that was seen or nicknamed the Butcher of Tehran because of his role in the 1988 massacre of 5,000 political prisoners. And of course, during his time as judiciary chief, which is a role he had before the presidency, he led a crackdown. And of course, there was the Women Life Uprising that also happened under his presidency, which led to what the United Nations fact-finding mission has called crimes against humanity that were being committed during those mass movements against the regime.
So we have heard this on this show before as well from activists inside Iran, and I do wonder then, given that there have been, as you say, some celebrations, what does that mean going into these elections? Presumably there's still not necessarily excitement about these or any hope that things are going to change.
Well, we just had parliamentary elections in Iran in March. They were the lowest turnout in the Islamic Republic's 45-year history. And additionally, the same thing happened during the 2021 presidential election, which was engineered in a way that handed the presidency on a silver platter to Ibrahim Raisi. So we've had two elections with historically low turnouts, and that trend is going to be continuing. Part of the reason, of course, is that there is a vetting body called the Guardian Council that decides who can run. And so they've engineered the elections so that power is consolidated to the so-called hardliners or principalists in Tehran.
Well, and so to that point, then I guess now that we have this registration deadline, opening now for the next few days, we have had some announce already. There have been a mix of hardliners and some reformists, as I understand. But to your point, is there any likelihood that the reformist camp will be actually allowed to stand?
Given the last two elections, I would say no. One character that actually has run as a reformist is Mustafa Kavian. He's a reformist politician, but he was disqualified in 2021. So I think we're going to see a lot of disqualifications. But even if the possibility that such characters are allowed to run, I just don't think that it's going to move the average Iranian to want to vote, because they're fed up with the status quo. There's systemic mismanagement, corruption, repression, and I think that they've realized that voting means that you're saying yes to an Islamic Republic.
Thank you very much, Holly Dagras. We'll have more updates on Iran going forward, I'm sure. You're listening to The Briefing. And finally to the Netherlands, which has a new government and prime minister as of this week, after months of deadlock following last year's national elections. That notwithstanding, there is another election just next week, this one for the European Parliament. With that in mind, for our continuing series on the European elections, here's Stefan de Vries looking at the European views of the Netherlands.
If you're looking for election fever, Amsterdam or The Hague may not be the best destinations. A survey found that only 35% of Dutch voters are interested in this year's European elections. Brussels and its institutions remain a slightly abstract and distant concept, even in the country that was one of the founding fathers of the European Union, says Theresa Kuhn, a professor of European politics at the University of Amsterdam.
On the streets, you hardly see any posters. Also in the media, it is playing a minor role, and this all has to do most probably with the fact that we've had general elections in the Netherlands 6 months ago, but only 2 weeks ago the coalition partners could really agree on joint plans, and only this week they announced who will be the new Prime Minister of the Netherlands.
While the campaign is in full swing in other countries, the upcoming Dutch government, which will likely start in earnest at the end of June, plans a rather Eurosceptic course. So how will that attitude influence the future position of the Netherlands in the European Union?
Yeah, I have the impression that Dutch politicians like to pretend that they don't need Europe, or that it doesn't even exist, and that they can just do everything without it. We still have to see what they really will do. It is true that in their plans they have been very Eurosceptic, and they have been pleading for several opt-outs. In general, their plans were highly unrealistic. However, we do also see already now some changes in the approach. You can also say the same for the Prime Minister, because he is actually he has been a Dutch civil servant for decades. So that is also quite different to this very roaring Eurosceptic approach that we have seen from Wilders. So also from him, I expect him to be more cooperative and more open to European integration than Wilders.
Most European citizens will vote for a party they already know from national politics. But this year, in 15 member states, they can also vote for a pan-European party. It's called Volt and was founded in 2017 as a response to Brexit. Reinier van Landschot is its lead candidate in the Netherlands, and he explains what makes Volt so different from the traditional parties in Europe.
Politics has always remained a national affair, and we are trying to innovate politics and breaking through that barrier of national politics towards a European democracy. And I think a European political party is best capable of doing that. One single program, and that's quite unique, because even the Greens, for example, who for some seem like the same party across Europe, have very different programs on the national level and also sometimes even on the European level. Even though they collaborate, they have different programs. But our party program was co-created by thousands of Europeans across the continent and is the same in every country that we participate in.
So in 15 countries, in the Netherlands you are doing well in the polls. You may get 1 or 2 seats in the European Parliament as a newcomer. How is that in the other 14 member states?
If the current polls are correct, then we will definitely get a couple of seats in Germany as well, and then possibly in Spain and Cyprus.
Yet with the lack of interest in European politics in the Netherlands, Van Landschot has to work hard to convince voters to go to the polls next week.
Yes, there's a lot of explaining to do, which I'm happy to do, because it's important to create more awareness of all the things that are going well and inside the EU, and that we can be thankful for and that we should build upon, but also to go beyond the sometimes very shallow criticism that I see, because Volt is not only very pro-European and wants to unite Europe, but is also very critical of things that are going wrong inside the EU, a lack of democratic legitimacy or a lack of opportunity to decisively act on all these big challenges that we face in 2024. So those things is what we are trying to change as well.
With polling relatively stable, the populist PVV and the left-wing alliance of the Green Left and the Labour Party are likely to become the biggest in this year's European elections. But if certain groups of voters do show up or stay at home, it can affect the election outcome. 5 years ago, turnout was a meager 41% in the Netherlands. Will it be higher this year? We asked Theresa Kuhn of the University of Amsterdam.
Well, that's a really good question. On the one hand, I would expect that the turnout will go up simply because there are many important decisions being taken at the European level right now. So I think that many citizens are aware that European politics is important. At the same time, we do not see any campaigning in the Netherlands. So I'm afraid that many citizens are not even aware that there will be an election in the week.
There is clearly a perceived lack of drama around this year's European elections in the Netherlands. Generating widespread enthusiasm and engagement among Dutch voters has proven challenging, even though European politics impact their daily lives far more than they are aware. For Monocle in Amsterdam, I'm Stefan de Vries.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and do stay tuned to the briefing next week as our European election series continues. But that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Paige Reynolds, our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, have a good weekend, and thanks for listening.